Hello, everyone, and welcome to BC Forests, the Peoples Convergence. Today, I'm honored to be here with our guest speaker, Ben Parfit. Welcome, Ben.
Glad to be here.
And Taryn Skalbania is one of the co-organizers of our event. Welcome, Taryn.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
So today we're going to be talking about the lack of public control of forests and the absence of information. And Karen's going to take it away. She's going to go through some Q&A with Ben, and then I might have a few questions at the end. I'll chime in. So Karen, who's done a lot of work co-hosting this summit, she grew up in East and West Vancouver, and she now calls Peachland home, where she and her husband Rob now manage their hobby farm. And Taryn volunteers for various community groups, including the Peachland Residents Association, the Mayor's Compost Committee, the BC Coalition for Forestry Reform, and the Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance. So when Taryn came to the Okanagan, she was shocked and appalled at the industrial and multi-use of the backcountry, especially the unrestricted use of a community watershed. And it's this unbalance that's driven Taryn to co-found the Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance. And they work toward educating and informing Peachland residents on the threats and pressures on their watershed. And I'd like to also talk about Taryn's thousands of hours of work that she's put in across the province, attending meetings and summits and convergences, and working tirelessly towards saving forests across BC, not just in Peachland. So thank you so much, Taryn, for your work. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, don't let my husband know how many thousands of hours I'm not working on the farm. Apparently some sort of fairies take care of all the animals on the farm at night, and I don't have to do it. So I'm really happy to be part of the BC Peoples Convergence for Forests. It's wonderful to be here, and I would like to introduce our guest, Ben Parfit. And it's a little uncomfortable for me. I'm normally on the other side. Ben has interviewed Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance twice and written 2 articles in the Narwhal. So this is certainly, the tables are turned, and now we get to ask Ben Parfit questions. So Ben, rather than me giving you your bio, I just would like you to tell us what came first: advocacy, journalism, investigative reporting. How did you start your career when writing about protection of forests, lands, and water?
Well, I grew up in southern Ontario and had actually never been further west than Sault Ste. Marie when I came to Vancouver in 1986 to start a summer posting with the Vancouver Sun newspaper. And I was one of 4 people that was lucky enough at the end of that 5-month posting to get kept on. And I quickly gravitated into writing about forestry and environmental issues when I was at the paper. I was at the paper for 7 years and spent about half my time at the paper in the late 80s and early 90s writing fairly extensively on forestry issues. So that's where I really started to get interested in forestry issues and environmental issues. And I still vividly recall arriving in Vancouver April 26, 1986, taking the drive in from the airport in Richmond and being struck very much on that first river crossing at the abundance of logs in booms on the river, the abundance of fishing vessels, and understanding very quickly that there was quite a connection between the biggest city in Western Canada and the surrounding hinterland that included forests. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that there has been, I think, a noticeable change in understanding about that kind of connection between city and the hinterland. I think it was much more pronounced. There was much more of an understanding of that connection then than there is now, which I think is interesting and very problematic. So I've always been very interested in understanding what is going on outside of the regions where most people in the province and indeed most people in the world live, which is cities. What is happening in other parts of the world where natural resources are exploited and typically make their way into cities where they are consumed. So that's been a kind of abiding interest of mine and continues to be an interest of mine to this day.
I was going to ask you, when you arrived in 1986 as a writer and somebody interested in the environment, did you right away enter the world of the forestry battle? Wasn't it really leading up to the War of the Woods in the late 80s, early 90s? Were you involved with that?
Yeah, it's a very good question in terms of situating what's happened over time. When I arrived in 1986, forestry disputes were really starting to come into the fray and into the public consciousness. I think the first sort of notable dispute that I was became aware of was that on Haida Gwaii. So the big disputes that were erupting on the southern portion of the archipelago were definitely something that I was aware of. And then very quickly we started to see a war in the woods, if you will, emerging in places like the Carmanah Valley on Vancouver Island, and of course later Clackwood Sound. And then after that, of course, the big focus on what became known as the Great Bear Rainforest. So yes, I kind of started to write about forestry issues as those battles were unfolding. I do find it very interesting that one of the kind of unfortunate side effects of those battles was that a lot of energy was sucked into campaigns like the Great Bear. And I think, unfortunately, what happened as a result of that was less attention and less resources focused on very important forestry issues that were unfolding in other regions of the province, particularly throughout the interior. And unfortunately, where we find ourselves today is that there has been over the decades, of course, a sea change in the way people receive and transmit information. It's not the same scene at all today than it was when I first arrived in the province. And I think that is something that is going to continue to make it a challenge for people that are interested in trying to reform the system as we know it today.
I want to ask you about that shift. You mentioned in your opening that there was a shift. You felt in the past there was more an awareness, a connection of the land. We're talking here mostly about forestry, but there's other land uses in the province that are under question. I feel there's a shift of 50-50 difference. Some people are way more connected with what's going on today, and there's much more awareness of what's happened to the land, and others are even less connected than our forefathers. They have no idea of the balance and essential benefits we receive from our natural forest, primary forest and land. Do you see that? Do you think some people are just very aware and there's this big public awareness that's forcing some changes in our province?
I think where you see change or the potential for changes is in those places where you have strong local interest and local residents pushing hard to try and make change happen. It's not to say that they're necessarily succeeding, but I think you need that in order for change to occur. I do think that there is an ongoing challenge that we face today that I think is more difficult than it was a few decades ago, which is that there does seem to be something of a disconnect, I think, in major urban centers with what is going on in the hinterland. And that is a very, very difficult nut to crack. I mean, I like to say that, you know, for most people living in the lower mainland, north is a place called Whistler, right? People don't get very far out of the cities that they live in, and as a result don't understand readily what is occurring in the hinterland that is required to keep people living in the styles to which they're accustomed.
Right.
So, you know, wood is something that comes from Home Depot. It's not what comes from the forest. Electricity is what happens when you turn a light switch on. It's not connected in people's minds with the massive WAC Bennett Dam or the Peace Canyon Dam or the Site C Dam that is being built. These things don't become real until, I believe, until people actually see them and experience them firsthand. And once they do, I think that can make a tremendous difference. Certainly in the big kind of battle in the woods campaigns that characterized the 80s and 90s, campaigns like Clackwood Sound were helped along immensely by the fact that hundreds and hundreds of people made the trip to Fino and Clackwood Sound and actually saw in the process of going there and coming back what was happening to the forest. And I think that allowed for more engagement and passion than would be the case otherwise. And it is the case that we haven't seen any kind of concerted civil disobedience and focus on forests and protecting forests now that we saw back then. And it's a challenge to figure out how to get more people animated about these things and trying to push for change, not just change from the perspective of conserving more forests, but change in terms of how our forests are managed, to what benefit, how communities should be situated in that. That is a very, very tough nut to crack.
And that's how we arrive at many meetings. People like Jennifer and I, we come to this great realization: we have the energy and knowledge, we know what's wrong, we have ideas to fix it, but where does the push come from? Why aren't people driving up to Clayoquot right now? Or, you know, when you drive through the interior and you see the checkerboards of clear cuts, why is that not motivating? I was going to ask you, do you think it's purposeful that either we just don't want to know that power comes from a really destructive dam when we turn on the switch, or that to get those 2x4s in Home Depot, we've had to clear cut some old growth areas? Do you think it's part of, it's been called the forestry industrial complex, a purposeful coalition of industry, government, academia, and even media? Your journalism is keeping us purposely in the dark. Do you think that is part of our absence of information that we are faced with?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have a ready answer for that. I think that where we find ourselves globally is in a world where more and more people are living in cities and are not living in rural settings. And in our lifetimes, we actually crossed a very significant barrier probably 20 years ago, where the world population overall went from being predominantly rural to being predominantly urban.
Wow.
And I remember when that the moment switched and we went from being predominantly rural to being predominantly urban. I remember reading a story at the time, and on that single day, 300,000 people more were living in cities than the day before. So we are more and more and more of an urban population. Many of us are living very, very busy lives. And as a result, it becomes very difficult to understand and deal with the reality of what it takes to provide the products that end up in our homes or that we use with regularity. I think it's just, in some cases, it's just overwhelming. People's lives are such that they just can't take that in and deal with it. Having said that, definitely there are people that are making choices with their consumption that reflect a desire to achieve a better kind of environmental and social outcome. I mean, I think a good example of that would be the people who are regularly making decisions that they are going to buy organic produce or buy, you know, or organic meat. They're making a very conscious decision based on a belief that particular choice is ultimately better for the environment, ultimately better for social well-being in some cases than the alternative. And we do see people that are making conscious decisions to where they can to switch their energy sources. And we do see some people that are making conscious decisions to, for example, buy, you know, forest products, or and I include in that paper products that have, you know, the imprint of the Forest Stewardship Council or something along those lines that indicates a higher level of management in their eyes than the alternative. I will say that the problem with that is that option isn't open to everyone. It's open to those people of means that are able to make decisions to pay a premium, and certainly in the case of organic food, that others simply cannot do because they don't have the means to do that. So I do think that there are signs of people that live in urban settings being well aware that there needs to be alternatives, and they are prepared to walk the line in terms of their purchasing decisions. I do think, though, that ultimately, if we really want to get people mobilized on a broader scale to affect change, it really helps a lot that they actually see and experience directly what is going on in order to become animated and more engaged.
That will tie in with our idea of lack of public control of forests. You mentioned earlier there's been communities throughout the province, Haida Gwaii, Gitsan, Chilcotin, maybe Herrick Proctor, many communities that have taken an interest locally and therefore have made noise locally and been successful locally. Do you, what if it's a community that's doesn't have an interest. Who decides which communities have say, and who decides, how can we work this? What if our neighboring community doesn't want to be a forestry dependent community, and what if we do? Like, how do we regulate that at all? Do you know any ideas?
I think what has to happen before change is possible is that people at local levels have to get very, very active and demonstrate that they have staying power on an issue in order to start to perhaps move it in the direction that they want it to go in. It's a difficult and a long haul, but I think it begins by people at the local level trying to be as engaged as they can and staying engaged for as long as they can, understanding that change will only come slowly and with an awful lot of work. I am very interested in the fact that certain communities have advantages that other communities don't have. And I think where there may be some hope is in trying to get decision makers engaged around issues of inequality. Why is it that certain communities and certain regions have certain benefits, in this case, benefits relating to how the forests or resources around them are managed, and other communities don't have the ability to do that?
Yes.
So one of the things that interested me early on in terms of forest management was water. I mean, waters are our most critically important resource, and forests play obviously a major role in not only water quality, but in water flow. And I remember writing stories as a freelancer for the Georgia Strait news magazine back in the day when they ran long investigative pieces about how waterborne disease outbreaks occurred in watersheds. You know, what gave rise to these outbreaks or exacerbated them. And one of the things that exacerbated them was forest clearing and road building, which opened up the possibility for water carrying much more sediment downhill into feeder streams and into water bodies that were then drawn on by local towns or communities as their water supply. And of course, when you have a lot of sediment in water, that sediment can mask potentially very troubling pathogens, and people can become sick. And people have become sick from Giardia and Cryptosporidium and other things that have ended up in community water supplies. So one of the things that I found very interesting was in the case of the Greater Vancouver Regional District, the GVRD has a 999-year lease to its watershed land, which provides a level of control over those lands that is pretty much unparalleled in the province. So as a result of working on those stories, you know, I years ago talked to people in the community of Kimberley, and people in the community of Kimberley were asking 30 years ago why it was that the city of Vancouver could have a level of control over its watershed lands, but the city of Kimberley could not. So I'm interested in those inequities. I think it provides a foundation for building fairly compelling arguments that there needs to be a greater degree of local control in place for the management of forest lands, where the primary use of those lands should not be for timber production, but should be for water provision and the provision of clean water. So I think that there are opportunities certainly to exploit the fact that certain communities seem to have benefits that other communities do not have, and asking questions of the relevant authorities about why that is the case.
Yes, I agree.
And I also think that, and this speaks to your experience, Taryn, in the Peachland area, is that when we or the powers that be do not allow local voices to be heard, the net effect may be that in the case of water, the damage to the watershed is such that the local community or region is going to be stuck with a horrendously high bill after the damage has been done to clean up their watershed, and unfortunately to make investments in water treatment that otherwise would not have needed to be invested in, had a different approach to managing those resources occurred.
I know Peachland for certain is the poster child of the multi-use land system. We had 5-month boil water advisories, and we know we've gotten rid of a beaver dam, one beaver dam with a family of beaver, but yet we allow 1,500 head of cattle to roam our watershed.
Yeah.
So there's just inconsistency is true. We have spoken with Will Coop as well, and you mentioned Vancouver's 99-year lease. And how can some community watersheds be protected in this province and others not? We all need and deserve the same equal protection. And that's something many communities are going to go after. We'll just become louder and more strong in that demand.
I think they will. And I do think that where there may be hope and opportunity is that if arguments can be made and it can be demonstrated that it is in the interests of the province, and it is primarily the province, to let go of some of its management authority by devolving some of that authority to local communities and regions, I think we may be approaching a point in time where there will be some receptivity to that idea, precisely because the challenges of managing forests are getting more and more complicated, and there's less and less resources available provincially to do the work. And if communities are able to demonstrate that they have viable plans that would allow for those lands to be managed in a different way that simultaneously took some of the financial burden off of the province, I think that we may be approaching a time where the province is going to be receptive to that idea. And I think we're starting to see signs of that in some of the work that's being done by people in the Quesnel area, for example, where there is a growing awareness that the extensive history of logging, particularly in response to the pine beetle, the horrendous forest fire seasons that have occurred, all pointing towards a system that is broken and needs to be not just repaired, but radically, we need to radically rethink how we work in that kind of environment. I think we're starting to see some openings for change occurring, and that change will include a significant component of more direct community and regional involvement in how those lands and resources are managed.
I'm going to stay on the watershed reserves idea for one more question, and then I want to jump to the Quesnel fire beetle area. But we have seen watershed protection in, like you said, Vancouver, Victoria, Lynn Valley, some areas of Coquitlam, and many communities want it. And then later in our BC Forest People Convergence, we will be speaking with Bob Williams, who is instrumental in putting in the ALR, as you know, the Agricultural Land Reserve, protecting land for farms, growing food, food security, farming, farmers. Wouldn't it be an idea to protect land for water, or for caribou, or for recreation, having reserves, areas throughout the province that the number one value is not timber extraction, but whole intact forests, so that the benefits of them could be, kept intact. Do you think there's some political legislation or political will or community power to move towards, preserving land, no-go zones, watershed reserves, something like that nature?
Well, I definitely think that there's a pretty compelling argument to be made for looking at new zones to protect or enhance certain values. I mean, this is not a new idea. The creation of the Agricultural Land Reserve is a very good case in point, where a decision was made decades ago that there was a finite amount of land in the province that was capable of growing food, that those lands, for a variety of reasons, were under threat, and that some kind of zoning was needed to protect such lands. I think it is entirely reasonable to suggest that the relatively small amount of the overall provincial land base in the province that is in community watersheds would be another place where having zoning rules in place would make imminent sense, not just ecologically, but economically.
Economically, yeah.
If there's a way to protect these lands and avoid municipalities and regions and the province and others from having to make huge investments in water treatment infrastructure, why wouldn't we want to try and protect those lands? I do think, and it is a very difficult conversation for people to have, but I think if we're gonna be honest, we also have to look at the fact that as a society, we're not going to stop consuming wood anytime soon. It's not going to happen. So should there be some discussion about zoning for other purposes? I think there should be. And we have to have a discussion about where it is appropriate to be growing trees for other purposes, whether it's for biodiversity, whether it is for timber production of some kind, whether it's for fire protection, where we're looking at using the lands in a different way. Part of the problem we have in British Columbia in terms of the growing ferocity and intensity of wildfires is we have trees growing where they didn't used to grow before.
Right.
So yes, we should be looking at zoning and rethinking zoning. And I think that caught up in that, and something again where we have to have a difficult but necessary discussion, is if we're going to be looking at zoning, and if we're going to be looking at important commitments that the government has made around reconciliation with First Nations, then we have to be looking at how we configure these zones in ways where lands and resources are being, at the very least, co-managed with local First Nations, and getting that buy-in early on in the process of zoning. In my opinion, one of the greatest problems we face is a lack of diversity in terms of approaches. We are living with the consequences of decades of essentially turning over vast swaths of the province, largely, not exclusively, but largely to a small number of corporations that have employed the same, relatively speaking, the same approach to managing those lands as their competitors do. So we have example after example after example of large areas of land being clear-cut, replanted largely, not exclusively, to those species of trees that are going to grow the quickest and be reestablished the quickest on those lands, so that the companies have met their reforestation obligations, and then they move on to the next area to cut, and they do the whole thing all over again. And I think that we need more diversity in terms of approach. We need to be shaking up the existing tenure system as it is in this province, so that we have a different configuration of licenses and management authorities. And we have to embrace the idea of experimenting and learning from different examples. What works for one community and one forest may not work for another. We need to open up ground for experimentation to occur. The more diversity we have, the better off we're going to be, because we're going to have different examples that we can look at that worked well or didn't work so well or failed. And through that process, we learn.
Well, and that's, I see, is what you've been doing. The challenge we have is no one's facing the truth about the reality of forestry in BC today. You're writing about the truth. We're talking about it here, but you just, we need, you said shake up the tenure system. We need to remove the tenure system, don't we? And replace it with something, yes, more ecologically based in each area. We need different ideas of protection and restoration. And I just read something you wrote, that we're not even restoring or planting trees in areas that have been burned or mudslides or beetle kill. The province boasts that they plant 2 trees for every one they cut down, but we're so far behind. We haven't been planting the entire forestry career industry's history. So how are we ever going to catch up? Don't we have to tell the truth now about the state of forest in BC?
Well, I mean, the state of the forests in the province, I mean, clearly there's example after example after example of problems. And we have to acknowledge that those problems have occurred, and we have to figure out what it is that we're doing that may be exacerbating those problems, and we've got to figure out what it is that we can do to stop doing that. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I think at the same time, we've got to be thinking very carefully about what it is that works and how we can better replicate that. So, where can we point to examples where watersheds are healthier than not? And there are examples of that. And what do we do, and how do we learn from that? Where can we point to examples of companies that are rejecting the idea of getting the lowest value? And when I say value, I mean, wood that is being, products that are being produced with the fewest hands. Where can we see examples of that versus examples of companies that are making the investments in new technology that is actually putting people to work? Right. And what is it that we do to encourage that outcome? Those are the kinds of things we need to focus on. I mean, on the one hand, we have on average over the last, I don't know, about 10 years, about 6 million cubic meters of logs, raw logs per year, leaving the province. All of the jobs, the thousands of jobs associated with processing that wood are accruing to the benefit of people outside of the province. Is that what we want as a society? If we don't, what do we point to as as the alternative? And there are examples of companies, very, very few examples, but examples of companies that are investing in new technology and making new products and putting people to work. So we have something I think that we need to focus on that end of the spectrum too. Like, what is it that we do differently that achieves outcomes that most people would say are desirable? If we're going to be exploiting natural resources in our province, I think most people would agree with the proposition that it ought to be benefiting the most people possible. So how do we go about doing that? Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking.
I understand. I, especially as a community organizer, a grassroots community group activist, I often get challenged with being anti-forestry or anti-jobs in logging. And nowhere has any forest activist ever caused somebody to lose a job in BC. It's never been about jobs versus owls or jobs versus caribou. It's industry and government are often responsible for the job loss, for losing positions in mills, for raw log exports, automation. So I hope that there's becomes a better understanding in British Columbia on what is really causing job loss. I wanted to ask you about some of your work. I should have done a better introduction. You've written 2 books on forestry, Forest Follies, Adventures and Misadventures in the Great Canadian Forest, and A Practical Guide to the New Forest Economy. Do you feel frustrated now after 20, 30 years of writing that things aren't changing? I just want, for one example, you wrote in 2005 that we're going to affect the midterm lumber supply if we up the mountain pine beetle hill cut in the interior of BC. And here we are 15 years later. Don't you find it absolutely frustrating that you want to strangle the government for non-listening?
Oh, I do find it frustrating. I think anybody that invests time in looking at how our natural resources are managed is going to get very frustrated at times with the way things are going. I mean, in the work that I do, I place importance on bearing witness.
Yeah.
We have to bear witness to what is going on. We have to report on it, and we have to hope that out of that change will slowly come. And there are examples of change, of where change has happened. So let's look back at Haida Gwaii as one example. Large area of the archipelago has been protected. Industrial logging rates are a fraction of what they once were. And there is a greater degree of control vested in the Haida than at any point in modern history. There are positive things that have happened there. There are still, however, immense challenges, and there will continue to be. So change happens slowly, but there definitely are significant achievements that have occurred in that particular region. And I believe that there's the opportunity for changes to occur elsewhere that would replicate or build on that kind of work. They may be the exception to the rule, but you got to start someplace, right? And I do think that we're seeing, we've seen examples of positive change, and I think there is the opportunity for more. I do think it's going to be very important that as we move forward, we see more opportunities for local communities and First Nations communities very much in that mix, being vested with management authorities or management authority that they do not currently have. And that is, I think, where significant change can occur, is when we free up space for communities and First Nations to start to do more work and be more actively engaged. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that as a result of some devolution of authority that we're automatically going to see things done to a higher and better standard, but it frees people up to try. And getting back to my earlier point, we need to see more examples of people trying different things in this province. And if we can achieve that change, I think ultimately positive things will occur out of that.
I wanted to also bring up your role in the Bob Williams report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative that you worked on. You helped review, edit, and research. And in that booklet, we did have 4 examples of community-driven success stories. And can we have more of that, do you think, in BC, and how do we get that?
Well, it's harder when you already have things in place to move to a different place, but we have examples of communities that have direct authority vested in them through tenure arrangements that were put in place a long time ago. So there are communities that have fairly sizable tree farm licenses that they directly control and that directly benefit their residents. So how do we go about trying to get more of that? In order to achieve that, there's going to have to be some redistribution of licenses. So then the question becomes, how do you get that? Well, there are some, I think, fairly immediate ways that you could go about doing that. So a large amount of the land base in the province is not taken up in defined area-based license agreements where a single company or entity has control over a very defined area of land. Rather, they're volume-based licenses where a whole bunch of entities may have little allocations of timber by volume, not area. Many of those licenses, those volume-based licenses, are what are called non-renewable licenses. So what the province could do is simply say, when those licenses come up for renewal, they're not being renewed. We're not going to renew them, and we're going to take that allocation, and we're going to start to do the things that we said we were going to do. For example, in terms of honoring our relations with First Nations people. That would be, I think, a tangible place to start. We're simply not going to renew a whole bunch of licenses when their terms expire. And then we're going to use that to try and leverage a change and move in a different direction.
I wanted to just talk to Ben a little bit more about the Restoring Forestry in BC report. And Ben, it came out a year and 8 months ago, and Jennifer can go into in more detail the summit and how we've sort of adopted the 4 asks or 4 recommendations of Bob Williams' report into our summit. But do you see any changes that you would add now to that report, or different recommendations that in the last year and 8 months may have changed the outcome of this report? Do you think is anything noticeably new or different or changing now in our province?
I think overall, the thrust of Bob Williams' report, you know, and what the report is advocating for is something that the province, by and large, still remains far, far away from enacting or embracing. I do think that at the end of the day, if we want to start to affect positive change, we're going to have to wrestle with the tenure system as it currently is defined. And we're going to have to figure out how we can free up space for communities being more directly involved, or regions being more directly involved in the management, the critically important management decisions that pertain to the forests and watersheds around them.
That's interesting. Jennifer and I attended a meeting last week, and one of the First Nations representatives said something similar. He said, first you have to change the map of British Columbia. It has to reflect our territories as entities, as working areas. He said, not TSAs. He says, what is a TSA? You know, and he said, or community watersheds as areas, you know, areas that rely on a local government or a function. So he said it has a massive shift or change, and he said there may be communities that don't want to log at all, period. They may want to go for carbon tax credits. He said it should be up to them. There may be communities that want to protect for salmon, for caribou, for flood control. He said they have to change, he said, a total way of how we could possibly look at our province as a tree being more valuable than the forest or the water or the air. He says it just doesn't fit in at all with, you know, First Nations point of view. So can you foresee that in the future? How do we change government and economics and policies for thinking that, you know, a community's value is not in just a tree or 2x4, like you said, but in more of a forest, a whole forest, an intact forest?
So the question is how do we get the provincial government
Yes.
to see that? Well, I do think that one of the ways that we may ultimately be successful in getting the government to see that is to make the argument that the current approach is one that is ultimately costing the province. So to maintain the things the way they are, it is to saddle the province with potentially, you know, significant costs that could be avoided if a different approach to management was taken. And I think that's where we have to start to look, you know, is there an argument that can be made that the system is broken and is actually not in the province's best interest to continue to maintain. And I think in some areas, and the Quesnel area would be a good example, you've got a landscape that, you know, the mayor of the town, Bob Simpson, you know, correctly describes as a blown out landscape. So the board has been wiped clean. We've got an opportunity to start over again. And starting over again surely should not involve trying to replicate what we did before. Again, it should require that we think and act in different ways. And I think that we're going to see more and more receptivity to that because you know, there's just example after example after example of things not working the way that one would reasonably hope them to work.
I wonder then what is the tipping point for the province in terms of the costs? I spoke to an MLA who shall remain unnamed. This was about 1.5 years ago. So granted, some things have changed since then, but this MLA's response when I went to them and I said, look, the flood of Grand Forks, for example, is costing the province. It's costing British Columbia taxpayers millions of dollars for recovery. So, and this MLA said to me, the government isn't going to take action until there's 30 such floods or 300 such floods is what this MLA said to me. And you know, you're talking about examples in Quesnel, and Peachland is another example, and other numerous watersheds across the province. So my question is, you know, and then there's the article that recently came out by David Broadland in Focus on in Victoria, and he talked about how forestry has cost BC taxpayers $3.65 billion over the past 10 years. So my question for you, Ben, would be sort of, you know, where is that tipping point in the government? Like, what's it going to take for them to see that the costs are outweighing the benefits? What's your feel on that?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a rather depressing commentary if the MLA is correct, that we need to see, you know, more and more examples of disaster before the government is going to move. That's a pretty frightening comment. Maybe that's what's it's going to take to see the provincial government embrace change across the board. I would hope that would not be the case, but maybe that's what it's going to take. I think the thing to be focused on is, you know, can individual communities and individual regions muster the resources and the strength to push for change at the local level, putting aside, you know, the bigger objective of trying to achieve change at a larger scale, and that's going to require a lot of work, and it's going to require a lot of time. But it is the case that, you know, and I spoke about Haida Gwaii earlier on, where the lay of the land on that archipelago is different than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? Things have changed. It hasn't gone as far as many people at the local level would like, but it has moved considerably. And I think that we're going to see, and we have seen examples of that elsewhere in the province, where very large areas of land, you know, have been set aside, and where a somewhat different management regime is in place. And what we've got to try and figure out is you know, what's it going to take to make that happen in other regions of the province. I think the fact that you have, you know, very significant events that have occurred in places like Grand Forks, where you've had, you know, horrendous events involving flooding, where there is clear evidence that a very large portion of the watershed lands has been logged. There are opportunities that are going to open up as a result of that crisis. And, you know, maybe that is where opportunity arises. You know, that things have got to a point which is very difficult and bad as far as a lot of local residents are concerned. And that may be what it takes to achieve a groundswell for change at a local level.
Great, so thank you for that. Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question of you, Ben, and then I'll turn it over to Taryn to ask one last question. So I'm asking this of all of our guests, and one of the things that we're trying to achieve with this particular summit is to inspire and motivate individuals to take action and get involved in some strategic tactics and strategic activities. Can you think of an example of a person, an individual, a community person who's done it? Someone who picked up the baton and made something different happen in their community.
Well, I mean, you know, I have spoken on and off about Haida Gwaii, and I think that that is a good example where you had, um, um, you know, very important leaders like Gujau who acted as you know, they were a catalyst for change, and they were joined in their efforts to try and achieve change, ultimately by other people from other sectors of the local region or communities that started to push in you know, in a similar direction, calling for, you know, more community-based solutions. And it was as a result of that, very importantly, over time, that we started to see things moving in a desired direction. So, you know, that is, I think, is a very clear example where individuals, not just an individual, but individuals really started to make a difference. I'll give us another example. You mentioned Will Coop. Will Coop's work in the Greater Vancouver area ultimately was instrumental in stopping the GVRD from continuing with a logging program that really could not be defended.
Right.
And so he played an instrumental role in stopping ongoing industrial logging in those watersheds. I mean, it was at a much smaller scale than logging in other community watersheds, but it was really through the efforts of Will and a couple of other people that were dedicated to trying to expose what was going on in that particular area that led to very significant change. So it does happen, and it will happen again. And I think that we, you know, my hope is, and I think we will see other individuals in other communities and regions of the province, particularly in when it involves forests that are in watersheds. I think that there is prospect for individual action achieving significant change.
So Will Coop, you spoke about him exposing some of the problems. Were there any other tactics or methodologies that he used besides reporting and exposing?
No, really, it was dogged documentation, and then working to find ways to get that documentation out into the wider world that ultimately allowed for that success.
Yeah, it was before internet, so he did a lot of letter writing, a lot of photographing, a lot of town halls, public meetings.
A lot of report writing.
Yeah.
Book.
You know, he and Vicky husband both told me that at the time they were told by government and industry that actually logging a community watershed will open it up more to allow water to flow better, and more water will come into our water reservoirs.
Exactly.
That's the kind of mythology we're up against.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had one last question about the absence of information. About, you know very well that Peachland a year and a half ago wrote a letter to the Ministry of Forests asking for a moratorium on logging, a community assessment report, and the stakeholder group to be formed. We have yet to even receive a reply back from the Ministry of Forests. So that's lack of transparency. And you know how you have to spend your whole time on freedom of information, or now what they call open information line, to find out what's going on in our forest. How do you recommend a small group, community group, or people like Jennifer and I deal with this when our own government won't even talk to our own mayors, never mind us?
It's a very difficult nut to crack. It definitely is the case that that there is less information flowing than used to be the case. And that we have to work very, very hard to, in some cases, to wrest that information from government. In my experience working on freedom of information requests, people that want to try and use that as a way to expose problems in their areas, or bring or shed light on an issue, they just need to think very carefully about the time that is going to be required to go down the rabbit hole of doing an FOI, and should think very strategically about what it is that they're asking for and why. Using freedom of information requests as a kind of fishing expedition is a bad idea. You want to have a very good idea about what it is that you want to try and get at, with somewhat of a reasonable expectation that that information might be there. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time.
Well, and on that note, here in Grand Forks, those of us who went through the flood buyout last year, we requested documents from the local government about the flood infrastructure plans that they've been given $54 million for. A year later, we still have nothing. On that note, we can wrap it up. And thank you so much, Ben. I love the way that you've been talking about opportunities. That's what we're moving towards. That's what we need. We need to know what those opportunities are and what directions we should be going as individuals and as communities. And thank you so much, Taryn, for those really insightful questions. Great conversation here, you guys. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, Taryn.
Thank you to both of you. Really, really appreciate it, and appreciate your understanding. Thanks so much.
Okay, and I'm signing off. I'm signing off from the Syilx unceded traditional territory.
Okay. Right, and yes, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am currently living not just in what we call Grand Forks, but the traditional territory of the Syilx and the Sinixt and the Ktunaxa. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Ben.
Greetings and thanks from the territory of the Lekwungen people.
Say that again. That was real quiet.
Lekwungen.
Thank you. All right. Take care, you guys.
Bye-bye.